Alright, with Murders at Karlov Manor being fully previewed, I looked at all the cards, and if you look back at my channel, you'll see that I talked about what I think are going to be the top 10 standard cards from the new set. But let's talk about what I think are going to be the top 10 cards for Commander. So these are cards that are going to go into the 99. First off, honorable mention for the land cards. The lands that have come out this cycle are all 10 guild color combinations. And what is cool about them is that they are the land type. So, for example, the Gruul one is a mountain forest. The Azorius one is a plains island. So even though they're not the most impressive lands because they enter the battlefield tapped, they are fetchable. So that is pretty cool about it. That's what I do like about it. And when it enters the battlefield, you surveil one. So especially if you have graveyard synergies, this is a pretty neat land. So I did want to mention it as an honorable mention that these lands are not to be overlooked for Commander. They're pretty solid. So before I dive into the top 10, I just want to say take the actual ranking with a grain of salt. These are mainly just the 10 best cards for Commander, and I tried to kind of put them in a certain order. However, of course, there's a lot of different Commander strategies, so determining which card is truly number 1 and which one is more like number 5, that was a little difficult to do. So take that with a grain of salt, but these are the top 10 cards for Commander to go into the 99. So number 10, I picked Cranco's Buzz Crusher. Cranco's Buzz Crusher is 2, a red and a red for an artifact creature, Insectopter. It's a 4/4 with flying and trample. When Cranco's Buzz Crusher enters the battlefield, for each player, destroy up to 1 non-basic land that player controls. For each land destroyed this way, its controller may search their library for a basic land card. Put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. This is really cool because it's basically a demolition field on steroids, where it's on a 4/4 flying trampling body. And it's an artifact. So it's a really cool synergy of things that are happening here. One thing that's really neat is it's not target non-basic land. Because it doesn't say target non-basic land, you can hit the hexproof lands like Lotus Field. So Cranco's Buzz Crusher effectively destroys a Lotus Field. Also, if your opponent has some special lands that you want to get rid of, Cranco's Buzz Crusher does that. It makes it to where you get to filter your own deck and put a basic on the board, but it also means that you can take the biggest threat lands from your opponents and take them out with Cranco's Buzz Crusher. Also, being a 4/4 flying trampler is not nothing, so that's a pretty good body to have with an effect like that. And I like the fact that it's an artifact creature. There's a lot of really solid artifact decks, artifact synergies, ways to find artifacts. So all in all, on a creature, this is a combination of really cool effects that are really powerful. So I think Cranco's Buzz Crusher is going to be a staple in a lot of Commander decks, especially if you're in red, if you're in artifacts. Cranco's Buzz Crusher is really, really good. So number 9, I put Undergrowth Recon. It's 1 green for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, return target land from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So in green, you like to ramp. There's a lot of really solid green commanders that care about ramping, that care about playing multiple lands per turn, whether it's landfall triggers, whether it's ramp effects. Being able to keep cycling lands from your graveyard is really effective. Now, this is especially good if you run the lands that when they enter the battlefield, you get to sacrifice them and find one of your basics, for example, that were in the set with the Cabaretti Revels, the Riveteers, Overlook, those kinds of cards. But even if you don't have that, if you have other sacrifice effects for your land, so let's say you play Thalia on the Gidrock monster or just a Gidrock monster, and you have to keep sacrificing lands, being able to keep playing them back every turn automatically is just really, really solid. So Undergrowth Recon is going to find a home in a lot of those kinds of decks, and I think it's going to be very powerful, and it's definitely going to be one of those enchantments you want to shoot down quickly. So for number 8, I put Buried in the Garden. For 2 green and a white, it's an enchantment aura. Enchant land. When Buried in the Garden enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent you don't control until Buried in the Garden leaves the battlefield. Whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional 1 mana of any color. I like this a lot because Enchantress is a very common commander deck type, and Buried in the Garden complements it really well. Being an enchantment aura by itself is really good type, and then being able to exile a non-land permanent is just really solid. Now, there's a lot of effects like this already, but what I like about this too is that it also ramps for a later game. Again, a 4-mana ramp card is not the greatest, but again, it's just a combination of everything that it does. Being an aura, being an enchantment, exiling a non-land permanent, and then tapping the land for additional mana. Just all in all, really good. Now, of course, can people blow this up and they get their permanent back? Absolutely. But all in all, if we just grade things by dying to removal, then we wouldn't have a list. So in a world where Buried in the Garden gets to do his thing, even if it's only for a couple turns, you get the ramp, you get the removal, and it's a very relevant type in Commander. So all in all, I would imagine Buried in the Garden going in a lot of Enchantress decks going forward. We're at number 7. Number 7, War Leader's Call. 1 red and a white for an enchantment. Creatures you control get +1/+1. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, War Leader's Call deals 1 damage to each opponent. So it's a Boros Anthem effect that also pings each opponent anytime you play a creature. This is especially powerful in token decks, because tokens, you put a lot of creatures on the board, and anytime a creature would enter the battlefield, it deals effectively 1 damage. So I could see this being in Boros tokens. Even if you just play Boros deck with a lot of creatures, it's still really good. So it doesn't have to be specifically tokens. But if you play a lot of creatures, War Leader's Call is going to be a really solid inclusion. If you play tokens, especially Boros tokens or Naya tokens, you're probably going to be able to put out a lot of damage with War Leader's Call. Not just because of your creatures hitting, but just your creatures entering the battlefield. War Leader's Call is going to be a staple in a lot of these decks, especially like Commander that's really popular since the last set is Anim Pakal. Anim Pakal, anytime you attack and you put a counter on Anim Pakal, as long as you attack with a non-golem, you put a ton of 1/1 golems on the board. Every one of those is already going to ping your opponent for 1, and it's going to be having the +1/+1 ability from War Leader's Call. So War Leader's Call is going to be very, very, very aggressive and a staple in Boros and Celestia tokens going forward. And even if you just have a creature-heavy deck, War Leader's Call is going to be a very, very solid inclusion. So that's why I put it in this list. So let's go to number 6. Number 6, I have Anvils Rampage. It's 3 a red and a red for a sorcery. Destroy all artifacts you don't control. Then exile the top X cards of your library or access the number of artifacts that were put into graveyards from the battlefield this turn. You may put a creature card exiled this way onto the battlefield. It gains haste. Return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. This does a lot, and I like this a lot because, first off, being able to blow up all your opponent's artifacts without hitting your artifacts is really solid. Because typically any kind of artifact board wipe, if you will, hits yours as well, and that's typically something you're really going to weigh out if that's what you want to do. Especially if you're in red specifically, and not like Gruul, but like red Boros, red with blue, whatever. You're not going to have as much ramp as like a green deck would, and most of your ramp is going to be in the form of artifacts. So you don't want to wipe that out most of the times. Being able to have the one-sided board wipe where you keep all your artifacts and you destroy all the others is just really powerful. And then the second effect is just icing on the cake if you're in a creature-heavy deck. Looking at the top X of your library, which is like, let's say each opponent has 3 or 4 mana rocks and treasures, clues, whatever. Now, granted, in response to this, they would probably sacrifice their treasures. But even if they wouldn't, let's say you get 6 to 10 artifacts with this. That's pretty deep that you go into your library. And putting any creature onto the battlefield for a turn like that is really, really good. It could be a really big creature that hits hard. It could be a creature with a really solid answer to battlefield effect. Whatever that may be, it's going to be a really aggressive move. Now, you might not always have a good attack with it, so that's why this is even better if you have creatures with answer to battlefield effects. But all in all, it's just bonus, and you just get the creature back into your hand at the end of your turn anyway. So the only thing that's kind of a downside of this card, and the only thing that I've heard make people a little bit wary of this card is that when you look at the top X cards of your library, it's all exiled. So it's not like the card that you don't pick. So if the card you pick obviously goes onto the battlefield, everything else stays in exile. So that's kind of a downside here. But other than that, really, really solid card. What's cool about it, though, is if you have other synergies that care about playing cards from exile, then it becomes even better. So it's a bit of a downside and an upside depending on the kind of deck you play. But all in all, one-sided board wipe for artifacts, really, really good. All right, the top 5. Analyse the Pollen for a green. It's a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you may collect Evidence 8. Collecting Evidence 8 means that you would exile cards from your own graveyard with a total mana value of 8. You search your library for a basic land card. If Evidence was collected, so if you exiled mana value 8 total from your graveyard, instead search your library for a creature or land card. Reveal that card, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So effectively what this is, early game it is search your card for a basic land. Early game it's just mana fixing, which is fine in Commander. Later in the game, this becomes a tutor for a specific land or creature, which in green can be really, really powerful. Which in green could mean that Craterhood Behemoth. It could mean one of your crazy Eldrazi's. It could mean one really powerful Praetor. There's a lot of really powerful creatures that you want to tutor for in green. And Analyze the Pollen allows you to do that for only 1 mana, as long as you can exile some stuff from your graveyard. Which, again, later in the game of Commander, you probably can. Now, if you're just in green with another aggressive color, that's one thing. But if you're in green and black, it's going to make it very easy to fill your graveyard. So, all in all, this is just a very, very flexible card because it's never a dead card. Worst case scenario, it's just mana fixing later in the game, and Evidence 8 is not that bad. That's 2 or 3 bigger creatures, slightly bigger creatures, or some enchantments or artifacts or whatever. Very easy to do that Evidence 8 if you're a couple turns into the game. So Analyze the Pollen is just a very, very efficient card. Tutors are good. A 1-mana tutor is even better. So Analyze the Pollen, I think, is going to be a really powerful staple in Commander for green decks. Number 4, Forensic Gadgeteer. 2 and a blue for a creature of Vidalcan Artificer Detective. That's a 2/3. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, investigate, meaning you create a clue token, which is an artifact with 2, sacrifice this artifact, draw a card. Activated abilities of artifact you control cost 1 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the mana in that cost to less than 1 mana. Blue loves artifacts. There's a lot of really powerful artifact decks in Commander. They are also typically very popular. Emery is one that really comes to mind here. If you run Emery, Forensic Gadgeteer is going to be so powerful because you play a lot of cheap artifacts. So anytime you play one of those, you get a clue on it as well. So that really increases the value of having all those artifacts on the board. It makes it very, very strong. You get a ton of artifacts on the board. And again, you get to activate all those activated abilities for 1 less. So especially those clues, anytime you create a clue for only 1 mana, you get to crack the clue and draw a card. So all in all, Forensic Gadgeteer, not just in Emery, but I feel like any artifact deck is going to want to pick up a copy of this card because it just generates so much value. Because of the discount and because of all those clues that you're going to be creating. There's really not that much to say about this card. I think it's very straightforward in how powerful it is. I feel like I don't have to convince you how powerful this is in any artifact deck because it's just going to go nuts really quickly. This is going to be a kill on sight card in Commander for sure. So let's go to the top 3. The 3 best Commander cards from the new set to put into the 99 of your deck. Deadly Coverup. 3, a black and a black for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you may collect Evidence 6. Destroy all creatures. If evidence was collected, exile a card from an opponent's graveyard. Then search its owner's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with that name and exile them. That player shuffles, then draws a card for each card exiled from their hand this way. That's a lot of text, and I already hear you thinking, why do I want to look for my opponent's hand, graveyard, library for cards with the same name? Because this is a singleton format that doesn't make any sense. Why is this in your top 10? Why is this in your top 3? Well, because it is the first, well, not the first, but it is an unconditional black board wipe for 5 mana. That's the cheapest unconditional board wipe that we have in black mana from now on, at least for a little while until they print another one. The other one was the one in the snow, Blood on the Snow. Blood on the Snow was 6 mana, so now for 1 mana less, we can have a board wipe that's unconditional. The other one that did that was the Crux of Fate, but Crux of Fate is not unconditional because you have to pick dragons or non-dragons. What are you going to do if you have an opponent that plays dragons and an opponent doesn't play dragons? You're going to have to pick which board you destroy. Deadly Coverup destroys everything. So Deadly Coverup is the first 5 mana unconditional black board wipe that we have here. So that's why I put it in here in the top 3, because I feel like any black deck that wants board wipes is going to want a Deadly Coverup. Just play it, look at how much Crux of Fate is being played. Unless you play a dragon deck that runs black, you're going to replace your Crux of Fates with Deadly Coverup. The Evidence 6 thing is not something you're really going to do unless you want to be really, really, really mean and an opponent tends to have a basic land in their graveyard. If your opponent has a basic land in your graveyard, you can potentially take out all the basic lands out of their deck if you collect Evidence 6 by selecting the basic land and going through their hand and library and getting rid of all their basics. Now, that might not necessarily be good because all you're doing is filtering lands out so that their draws become even more hot. But if they run a mono-color deck, for example. But we're talking full-on Disneyland stuff here. Is the perfect scenario where your opponent runs a mono-color deck, they already have a basic in the graveyard, and you get to exile all of that. That's probably never going to happen. Plus, it makes you incredibly unpopular, so I would not recommend doing that in a game of Commander. But it's an unconditional board wipe in black for 5 mana. Very easy inclusion, in my opinion. Very powerful card. Number 2, Insidious Roots. Black and a green for an enchantment. Creature tokens you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. Whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a 0/1 green plant creature token. Then put a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control. This enchantment does a lot. What's really, really powerful is just the fact that it turns all your creature tokens into mana dorks. So obviously, in green and black, you have a lot of opportunities to create tokens, especially in green creature tokens. There's forest dryads, there's obviously the plants, there is all kinds of stuff. And if you create those creature tokens, so for example, let's talk about Skewed Swarm. Skewed Swarm is already obnoxious as all get, but let's say you have a Skewed Swarm, you have a little bit of landfall, you create multiple little Skewts, and those Skewts now are all mana dorks to where you can play your Crater Hoof Behemoth. Again, we're talking very specific scenario, but just to kind of catch your attention on what you can do with this enchantment. In these colors, you're going to have a lot of access to different types of creature tokens, and for 2 mana, turning all of those into mana dorks is really, really powerful, and you get your mana back pretty much instantly. Now, and also in green and black, there's a lot of ways to get stuff out of graveyards. Whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, so that could mean whenever you collect evidence, it could mean whenever you pull a creature back out of the graveyard, it could be one of your exile creatures like Graveyard Trespasser. There's just a lot of different ways to trigger that ability to get that 0/1 green plant creature token and putting +1/+1 on each plant you control. Not gonna lie, the +1/+1 on each plant you control is really cool if you really build around that. But what I'm mostly interested in is just that turning all your tokens into mana dorks. And that by itself is already really powerful. So that's why I put Insidious Roots in the top 10 and in the top 3, because that's just a really powerful ability. If you play Commander, mana is very important. You want to ramp, you want to have access to big, scary spells. And if you play a bunch of tokens and your opponent's like, they just got some tokens, I don't know what they're going to do with it. You play Insidious Roots and you instantly have a lot of mana to your availability. Really powerful card for that specific reason. Let's talk about what I think is the best new card for Commander to put into the 99 of your deck. It is World Soul's Rage. X, red, and a green for a sorcery. World Soul's Rage deals X damage to any target. Put up to X land cards from your hand and or graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. I like this a lot because of both abilities, honestly. If you are already a little bit into the game, obviously you're not going to play this for like total of two or for a total of like 3 or 4 mana. But you can if you need to ramp early on. That's what I like about the flexibility. But especially later in the game, if you already have a little bit of mana to your availability, you already have some lands in the graveyard, whether it's because you had landfall, whether it's because you have fetch lands, whether it is because you had sacrifice effects for your lands, or you turned your lands into creatures and they got killed in combat. All things that you do in these colors. Then being able to hit something for a bunch of damage and get all those lands onto the battlefield tapped means that you're going to be ramping like crazy while hitting something for a lot of damage. In these colors, that's incredibly relevant, especially if you're in like Jund, for example, like the world's. Oh, what's that cat? There's this cat thing that is a Jund commander, Windgrace. Thank you. Windgrace, for example, is a really good one that likes World Soul's Rage. Now, putting the number one card as a card that is mainly good for like 1 or 2 commanders. It seems a little odd, but I think it's going to be good in a lot of these decks because, again, even if you're not in the Jund landfall slash land sacrifice strategy, just in Gruul, it's a great way to ramp if you have lands in your hand and you want to get them on the board. Or, like I said, you've had fetch lands or the lands that died in combat because you turn your lands into creatures. Being able to bring those back with World Soul's Rage is just really powerful. And then being able to just deal X amount of damage to any target is just icing on the cake. Especially late in the game of Commander, that means that you can take out a player by just sending damage straight to face. So all in all, just a very flexible card that I think is going to set you up for really powerful spells later on. It's going to make it to where your lands feel more valuable because you can bring them back even after combat or after sacrificing them. All in all, just very powerful there. And even though I said earlier at the beginning of this little section of the card that you probably won't play it early on, you might though. Let's say you are at 4 mana, you got 2 lands in your hand, you already played a land for turn. Going from on turn 4 to having 6 mana on the board while hitting something for 2 could mean that you take out one of your opponent's mana dorks while ramping yourself. So especially it could put you ahead early on as well. So let's not make it sound that this card is only good late in the game if your graveyard is full of lands. You can also use it early just to ramp quicker and take out one of your opponent's mana dorks, effectively putting you ahead even more. So that's why I think this card is a really, really powerful card, and I think it's going to be a commander staple in these colors. World Soul's Rage, really, really cool card. I like this effect a lot. Also, this art is incredible. Only thing that's odd about it is it's a Gruul card on a Selesnya art, but whatever. So anyway, that was my top 10 for Commander. 10 cards that I think are going to be the best to put into the 99 of your Commander decks. Let me know what you think. If there's any cards that I didn't talk about, you're like, hey, this card would be super powerful in the 99. Make sure to put them in the comments. Also, like I said before, take the actual order of the ranking with a little bit of grain of salt because there's just a lot of different Commander decks and strategies. And really looking at these cards and determining which one would be more powerful than another is very hard to do depending on all these different types of strategies. So, appreciate you watching. Make sure you hit that like. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. It means a lot to me. I'm really trying to grow the channel a little bit. I've got a bit of a surge here lately, and I really want to be able to hit like the 250 by the end of next month. We're in February, so actually by the end of this month, that would be awesome. So like, subscribe. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for watching.